I'm Gabrielle Boisrame. I'm an assistant research professor of hydrology at DRI.
At hydrology, and yet here we are looking at fire.
Yes, well, fires have a lot of impact on hydrology because they affect the vegetation cover, and plants use water, and they can also intercept water, so keep rain and snow from reaching the ground in the first place. And they shade things, which changes evaporation, changes how the snowpack behaves. So yeah, that's a lot of what I do, is look at how the fire impacts the vegetation in the soils and how that in turn changes the water.
And we've got some really fun and interesting images to look at and have you describe some of the things that we're seeing. But before that, the question that just came into my mind is, as we're growing up and going through the first years of school, we learn about the four elements that the ancients had, that fire, water,
Mhm.
air, and earth. Were they pretty close to how the earth actually works, thinking of those four basic elements? You mentioned several of those interacting with each other.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, with critical zone science, definitely that's a lot of what we're looking at, is how those four things interact. And then, especially earth, water, and air are made up of lots of different chemical elements. And there are a lot of other people in our cluster who are studying the details of those. But yeah, you can basically break down a lot into, how is a lot of what we're doing, how is fire affecting the earth, which include, I guess you include plants in the earth. And then how does that affect how water moves between the air and the earth?
It's so complex.
Mhm.
Takes a lot of, I mean, we spent thousands of years studying these things, and I'm also, when I'm looking at like the AGU schedule coming out in December, all these things of, we've known these things, but we don't know much about this. And so it's
Mhm.
always fascinating to be seeing how the cluster members are pushing these boundaries and finding new things and seeing things they haven't seen before, like some of these images that you're sharing today. Go ahead, start talking about some of this stuff, because from my understanding, you've got before, during, and after images, which is kind of an unusual thing for you to be able to work with.
Yes, so these pictures are all from a place in Yosemite called Illilouette Creek Basin, which is a really unique place that I've been lucky enough to study for about 10 years now. And part of what makes it really special is that starting in the 1970s, the Yosemite park managers decided they were going to start letting fire back into this landscape, because this is a place that over thousands of years, the vegetation had evolved to burn fairly frequently. There would be lightning strikes in the summer that would hit the dry vegetation, would start fires. And so you'd have relatively frequent, but also relatively small and not super severe fires that would happen in this area. And a lot of the vegetation had adapted to be resilient to that, to be able to handle, um, coming back from these fires, and even to depend on fire to sort of thin things out, to keep the landscape more various, more heterogeneous, um, open things up so that smaller plants could grow in, keep the forest from getting too dense and needing too much water, and then getting too stressed when there were a lot of droughts. But in the early 1900s in the US, the government got really good at putting out fires, which seemed really great because you're protecting all your timber stands and protecting people's houses, which of course is very important. But if you keep all these forests from burning the way they've adapted to, then you completely change the ecosystem. You make them less able to handle droughts because you have all these dense trees that are growing that are all competing for a scarce amount of water. Lots of issues when you completely eliminate fire from these natural systems that
That's an interesting thing that
are
I
involved
hadn't
with it.
thought much
Yeah.
about, was that if you let the things grow and you suppress the fires, then
Mhm.
there's more life that's drawing upon a limited amount of resources, that the trees can't get the water that they need because there's little ferns and other plants growing. That's interesting
Mhm.
to think about.
Yeah, gets a little into Thanos territory of you need to remove some of the users of resources for everyone to be happy. But no, I do not condone Thanos's methods. He would his premises were not entirely wrong.
He
No,
had
you
some
need to worry
interesting
about scarce
ideas.
resources.
Just,
Yeah.
just asking questions, just asking questions.
Hmm.
So here you have some
Um,
examples of recent fire activity and disturbances in the area.
yes, so this is a fire that actually probably only just really completely stopped burning this week with the snow that they've been getting in Yosemite. This is called the Red Fire. Started sort of in middle of the summer. And these are some pictures of when there was a lot of activity going on toward the beginning of the fire, which went on for several months. And I didn't take these pictures, but some park employees who were on the scene did. And so you can see there's this big plume of smoke. There's an area that's burning pretty hot. But then also there's these places where you can see the photographer got right up close in some of these bottom pictures. The fire's just kind of creeping along the ground. And that's what we really like to see in these wildfires, is where, the fire's going through, it's removing some of these dead pine needles and things on the ground, um, and other fuels that if all of these fuels, by which I mean, twigs, pine needles, dead branches and such on the ground, if that was allowed to accumulate over a really long time, then future fires might get really, really big and be more destructive. But here you just have sort of a low intensity fire that's just kind of cleaning up the forest floor, making room for more things to grow. You can see most of the large mature trees are fine. They're getting a little bit scarred on the bottom, but they can handle that. And when I say this fire went on for months, I don't mean there were these big billowing plumes of smoke for months. I mean that basically, you had periods when there were these big billowing plumes, but also a long time where there's just little areas that are burning or smoldering. And then the sparks move and burn a different area. And it's just kind of slowly spreading out through as far as it can go until the rains and snows come and finish it. And I really like this top middle picture because it shows the legacy of all the previous fires that have happened in the area. You can see how there's these sort of shorter trees in the foreground, and then in the background, there's some taller trees. And this diversity of tree heights and densities are really important for having a lot of different kinds of habitats that different plants and animals can live in. And that's a kind of landscape that you only see if you allow these disturbances like fire to occur naturally.
So in the lower right-hand corner of screen right, there's
Mhm.
that image of the fire smoldering and moving through some of the underbrush, the needles and stuff, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
Is that what humans try to emulate when they're doing some fire control things, is to make that little low burning? Can humans do the same thing, or is it something only nature is able to do?
Oh, definitely. There's been a lot of emphasis on recent years of doing prescribed fire or control burns, which often, yeah, will look a lot like this, where people will walk along with a drip torch, where they can basically just start a little fire in the natural fuels, and they'll usually do that under really favorable conditions. So when it's not too windy, when the humidity is relatively high, it's not too hot, and so they can sort of keep the fire behaving this way. And that's a tool that the Park Service and Forest Service and other entities use a lot, but you really can't do it on the scale that a natural wildfire can. The fire managers in Yosemite are very busy doing these prescribed fires when and where they can, but they just can't cover the number of acres that can be covered if you just allow some of these lightning ignited fires to burn.
Has your work and your research contributed to some of those policy decisions about when and how you go out there and try to do those prescribed burns?
Well, exactly when they decide to do the prescribed burns, that's more about fire behavior, which isn't something that I study specifically. But I hope that my work into the impact of wildfires on the water balance, and the ecosystem, and the water cycle are helping policy decisions in terms of trying to do the prescribed fires more in general and trying to get fire back on the landscape, and just sort of adding a little piece to the narrative about why it's important to allow some fire on these landscapes rather than just trying to keep it out entirely.
Is that a tough outreach? The fire is good. We want a little fire sometimes, but people probably react very quickly, like, oh my God, fire
Yeah,
bad.
it's definitely tough. I mean, you see this smoke, and the air quality impacts of fire are real. I have been in California for many a summer where the air was just practically unbreathable, could hardly see the sun. And of course, I have friends who have lost their homes to wildfires. Of course, fire can be a destructive, unhealthy, frightening thing. But there are a lot of things in nature that are frightening and dangerous. Wolves, bears, sharks, but they're still important to the ecosystem and important to maintaining sort of the natural balance of a world that we all depend on. And so basically there is a place for fire that's very important. And also, it's impossible to stop every single fire. So that's what a lot of recent policy is realizing, that we have to live with fire, because, you can put out fires for a while, but eventually the fuels are going to build up. You're going to get a day that's too hot, too dry, too windy, and it's just going to turn into a way worse problem than if there had been some natural fires to clear out those fuels. And so basically you have to have, some people talk about good fire versus bad fire, which is a little oversimplifying, but you have to have some of the quote unquote good fire to be able to prevent the really bad fires, because in a lot of these, especially Western US dry landscapes, it's not a question of if something's going to burn, it's when and how it's going to burn.
And I lived in Alaska for many years, and the wildfires, wildland fires, hundreds of acres at once, all over this immense area. There's no resources to go out and make sure that they're all being taken care of. You can just sort of monitor them. One of the things that was interesting that goes along with, to me, that goes along with what you look at is not what fire is doing on the surface, but its effect underneath, on the water that's underneath the forest that goes on in there. Does the water boil? Does it get really hot? Do the streams and the rivers become like little saucepans that cook up algae? What happens to the water underneath a fire?
Yeah, definitely. Well, you can have some water that evaporates. And if it's burning really hot, then some water might evaporate off of streams and ponds and things. But also, but a lot of water in these landscapes is underground, and soil is a really good insulator. And so most of that deeper soil water is going to stick around and be relatively unaffected in the short term by the fire. Here's some pictures of an area where we have a weather station where it's in a little wetland. You can see some standing water on the ground here. And this is the first spring following a fire that came through in 2017. And then this will work. And then this is less than 2 months later. You can see all the vegetation growing in. And these grasses and flowers are just super happy that this fire, cleared things out, opened things up for them. They're getting lots of sun, they're getting lots of water. So in the immediate term, fire, of course, will dry things out and evaporate some water. But in the longer term, there's the water that stayed deeper underground, and more water is going to be available to fewer plants. And some smaller plants like these are going to be able to grow better because they're getting more sun. Maybe they were being shaded by the buildup of litter or by tall trees that have been burned away. And here's another place where we have some before and after pictures. So up on the top left, you have in 2016. So this is an area that had burned in 2004. You can see the blackened stumps of trees from that previous fire. But you can see between 2004 and 2016, some new trees are growing up, lots of shrubs, pretty dense. And then this fire came through in 2017, the Empire Fire. But then you can see over a couple of years, the shrubs are coming back. These ceanothus shrubs can actually grow back from the root. And you can see just kind of circle of life, vegetation coming back very happily, taking advantage of this water availability that they have now, that there's less competition.
Fascinating. It makes the image I just had in my mind was like when you exfoliate, your skin, you get like fresh. It feels so smooth and so nice.
Mm-hmm.
And then, then it gets a little crackly, and you keep on doing
Mm-hmm.
that. It's just taking self-care, some
Mm-hmm.
self-care of Mother
Mm-hmm.
Earth, of Gaia there.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah.
I
And in
wanted.
this
Oh, go ahead. I'm
site,
sorry.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say on this side, we saw the first year after the fire, you got some more evaporation because the soil was more exposed. So you lost a little bit of water, extra water in the summer that way. But then once things started growing back in, then it seemed like you had more water available throughout the summer.
So there's a weather station, a sensor array that's there in
Mm-hmm.
all of these images. And it costs money and time to put that there. Are they
Mm-hmm.
fireproof? Do they get damaged when fire moves through the
They're not
area?
fireproof. So this one, so in 2017, when the Empire Fire came through, basically I had just started a new job after finishing my PhD and postdoc at UC Berkeley. Like literally, it was my second day of my new job in Sacramento. And I got a phone call from some of the graduate students at Berkeley who had taken over the project from me and said, "Hey, you know that little fire that was in Yosemite that we thought wasn't a problem because it was plenty far away from the weather stations? Well, it's moving toward them now, and we have to go evacuate the stations." And so thankfully, one of my lab mates had talked me into writing down a plan to help people in just such a situation. And so we were able to get some volunteers together and also got some help from the Park Service to basically hike out. And they removed all of the electronics and sensors from these stations. And the only thing that they left was the soil moisture sensors that are buried underground. They left them down there and just buried the ends of the wires a little bit so they'd be protected from the fire, which was a little bit of a risk, but it paid off because the wires made it through the fire just fine, and we didn't have to dig up the sensors, which would have disturbed the soil and made the before and after comparisons not quite the same. And so this picture from 2017 is from that same graduate student, Katya Rakhmatulina, who had taken over from me. She hiked back out with a few people, and they put everything back basically as soon as they were allowed to get back out there after the fire passed through. And then they were able to get it back up before that winter came, which was really great. So yeah, not fireproof, but luckily there were people who were able to go out and evacuate them. But yeah, I got that call. I was like, oh, I'd really love to help you go and rescue the weather stations that I installed that are my science babies. But I really don't think that I should ask for my third day of my new job off.
Right. You don't mind if I just go back to people that
Yeah. Yeah. Can I just go back to my old job for a second?
I'll just be a week or so.
Yeah,
So
but it worked out great.
when they detach the wires from the sensors, do the sensors that are the sensors that are buried underneath,
Mhm.
Do they
So
continue to
they
collect
weren't,
data or?
so they were not collect, so unfortunately we have sort of a data gap when the fire came through. We did have one sort of backup temperature sensor attached to a tree that accidentally got left behind. So we actually do have that temperature, air temperature record, and you can see a big spike in the temperature when the fire comes through because it miraculously survived the fire. So that's kind of fun. But yeah, unfortunately, we do not have soil moisture or soil temperature data from during the fire because the sensors were disconnected from the battery and from the data logger.
Is that something that you want more of? Do you wish you had more data from while the disturbance was happening, or is technology advancing that you do get
Mhm.
more of that now?
I mean, there is some work you can do with that. I'm part of a project right now that's going to be looking at fire and sagebrush ecosystems. That's a joint project between DRI, UNR, and UNLV. It's a Nevada-based project. And we're going to be sort of doing some small burns within confined areas and also some um, prescribed burns where we can take some measurements using UAVs, so using drones, so you can measure things from a distance, and also maybe having some sensors in place that can measure during the fire. There's also and there are some projects that measure during fire. Usually it's a controlled burn where they know it's going to happen because that's part of the deal, right? You don't know when these natural wildfires are going to happen, so it's hard to set up a whole experiment based on that and then just wait. But now we've had this fire in 2017, and then in another part of the watershed, we have the fire that just happened this year, and that one burned through some areas where we did have some temperature sensors and had taken some measurements before. We didn't have the whole weather station set up like we have here, but I can show you some pictures of those. And then also a great tool that we have for seeing what's happening during a fire is satellite data, because that's going on all the time. And of course, is far enough away that the fires won't affect it.
That's really remote sensing up there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you, so is
Yeah, so
that, so I know there's like Landsat 9, I think is what they're on now, or is it Landsat 10? I'm not even sure which sequel of that satellite that's going on. But just, do they have data that you buy? Is it just
Landsat
crowdsourced?
is
Yeah,
free.
Landsat's free.
Mm-hmm. There are other um, there are some other satellite products that you have to buy. And a lot of the remote sensing that's taken like, from an airplane or from a drone, some of that becomes publicly available eventually. Some of it you have to buy or you have to pay someone to acquire it. So here's, sorry, there's probably a way to make this full screen, but and so here's where we had a time-lapse camera set up at one of our plots. Oh, sorry, it's not actually sharing it. Coming. There we go.
Aha.
Yeah, here's where we had a time-lapse camera set up. And so here is right before the fire, August 28th. August 31st, you can see it's actively on fire. There's some smoke. And then this is a couple of weeks later, you can see the aftermath. Some of these big logs have totally burned away and left ash. But some of the little shrubs are still alive and a lot of the big trees are still alive. A few of them are scorched. But I'll be really curious to watch this site and some other ones and see how they progress after the fire.
Does that, I mean, that's just fascinating to think about. Why did that particular plant and shrub stay there? Like, is that a research question that people are asking?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, looking at there people looking at, something about the moisture. I mean, some of it's luck, like I think these little plants that are growing right amidst all these logs lying on the ground, they didn't really have a chance once those logs started burning. But basically because this area had burned a little over 10 years before, so there wasn't even more litter on the ground. It was fairly open. Basically, the fire could burn low enough intensity that some of the plants were left alive.
So I can look at,
And
so
so basically, so there's things happening at all sorts of different scales, both spatially and temporally. But you can see basically because of the fire history previously definitely affected what happened in this fire. You can see, well, these down logs are also probably because of the previous fire. So like for this particular plant, the previous fire was not helpful because it was growing in this log, which had burned, which is dead because of the previous fire. And then it burned up. Although that plant is probably growing there because, you know, it was a nice little shady area. Maybe some moisture was accumulating. So that log was providing a nice little refuge with some moisture and respite from the heat. But then it just turned out not to be a good long-term home since then it burned up again.
I want to talk to you another time, but like,
Mhm.
let's put one of these together to find 100 different changes between the top and the bottom. It's easy to
Mhm.
find, but that's for a project for another time. But looking over on screen left, there's that log that's diagonal across the top photo, and then it's smoldering there in the middle
Mhm.
photo and completely ashed and gone
Yeah.
in the lower photo. And then there's
Mhm.
those logs that are going diagonally from screen left over to screen right that you can see are there. And then in the middle photo, those are already all gone.
Yeah.
And then you can see their little ashy charred remains afterwards.
Mhm.
So is this sort of the forensic work that you do on this sort of data to piece together what happened, to write about it, to explore it, to think about it, to give you ideas about how the
Mhm.
fire and the water and these systems interact?
Um, yeah, well, I usually work at sort of larger scales than how
Ah,
did this one log smolder. But definitely fire affects people look at this kind of thing really closely. But it is part of sort of the general picture that we're trying to tell through our research here, where we're trying to look at how do the previous fires affect the fuels on the ground, and then how does um, the weather in the area and the moisture affect the moisture of the fuels, and the moisture of the fuels will then affect how they burn, which then affects the landscape following the next fire. And so we look at how all of these things are connected and happen in sequence.
a big part of research like this is modeling, looking at something and then, okay, this is what might happen if we expand it out or take it to a larger level or bigger area like the areas that you look at. Is this something that you could model what happened and what we see here in the images on a broader scale?
Yeah, I mean, you probably couldn't model, you know, this particular log is going to disappear and the one next to it is not. But yeah, there are models that definitely look at, okay, you have these different dead woody fuels of different sizes, um, you know, based on the fire intensity, based on how much fuel is around, what the weather is like, what's been happening with the fire. You know, is it likely to burn only the very small woody debris? Is it likely to burn these larger logs that we call 1,000-hour fuels? Um,
Oh,
so these basic patterns you can see where basically like what burns, is it only the very small pine needles, is it the larger logs, is it all of the vegetation, um, sort of that different gradient of levels of what burns and what doesn't. That's a thing that can definitely be modeled, but definitely also a thing that we're trying to improve the models for. And some of the modeling work that I'm planning on doing with data from this area is sort of combining an eco-hydrologic model that models how vegetation grows before and after the fire, and how water moves, you know, from the ground through the plants into the air, and combines that with a fire process model that then looks at, okay, given the patterns of vegetation and where moisture is and everything, how does that affect the next fires? And then you can look at all the feedbacks there.
fascinating. I could take a lot of time asking you all these sort of stuff, but thank you. I have one more little question for you. Thank you for
Mhm.
taking some time today to talk. So my last question for at least this time around is, does all the stuff that is left over, like we see here, the ashes and the leftover part of the logs that have burned, then it'll go down into the ground, and does it make the soil and the water healthier?
Yeah, so the ashes can definitely be important for, getting different nutrients back into the soil. The fire can also sort of volatilize some of the nutrients that are in a soil. A lot of times we see lupins growing in an area right after a fire, which are these beautiful purple flower, because lupins are nitrogen fixing. And so there might not be a lot of nitrogen in the soil right after a fire. But the lupins don't need nitrogen in the soil because they can pull nitrogen out of the air. And so they can just kind of take over right after a fire because they can outcompete. And then the water, you often do see some negative impacts to water quality right after a fire because you're going to get more erosion. You're going to get some of that ash washing off into the water. But something that I argue, based on a lot of the reading and original research that I've done, is that when you have these more frequent smaller fires, you're going to have less of that erosion, less of that runoff impacting the streams, versus if you just had a few really big giant mega fires. Those mega fires are when you get the really bad sediment flows and pollution into the streams. And so it's sort of like the issue with air. So like both air quality and water quality, they're not going to be, they're both going to be a little bit worse during and immediately after a fire. But over the long term, you're going to reduce the impact of fires if you have these more frequent smaller fires, because you don't have these big giant mega fires that just make it impossible to breathe and make these giant debris flows into the streams and all of that.
You think about things on such a long scale,
Mm-hmm.
big areas of space and time. How do you stay
Mm-hmm.
focused on the here and now in your regular life?
Just think, well, getting out actually into the field definitely helps with that because, yeah, um, I'm sitting in my office and thinking about these large scales and modeling whole watersheds and how things might change over hundreds of years. But then it's really nice to get out there, and then when you're actually there, then yeah, you do get focused on like, wow, look at this one plant. How did it survive the fire? Oh, look at this seedling that's growing up out of the ashes. And so yeah, it really helped just to get out there, boots on the ground, and admire the small details.
Is the world ever going to stop fascinating you?
No.
Thank you very
I
much.
don't see how it
I'm gonna stop recording and we'll say goodbye after the recording. Thank you so much.
could.